Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from the Frontier, and thank you for stopping by. It was a pleasure meeting the team from Citadel, RVR, the IFC and DEG yesterday, and they of course hold the concession for the Rift Valley Railways. I'll put up a photograph of the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway, and it was a very interesting presentation that they made. Obviously, they've now all increased their stakes since Transcentury exercised a put option, and they were discussing the big picture outlook, and of course, the standard gauge railway is something that we spoke about as well. Home thoughts. I attended the funeral yesterday of my cousin Selena's and her husband Shrikesh's son Issar. Issar was due to turn 13. He'd been poorly for a while, however. The funeral was very touching, eclectic, because it sort of combined Shrikesh is Hindu, Selena is now Hindu, but it also accommodated our faith, which is the Smiley faith, and it was very touching actually, and made me feel how fleeting life in fact is, like how water can slip through your fingers. And I thought of the story of Kabir's funeral. When Kabir died, his body was claimed by both the Hindus and the Mohammedans. The king of Kashi, with thousands of Hindus, wanted to cremate the body. The Hindus claimed that Kabir was a Hindu and that therefore his body should be burnt. Bizli Khan, with thousands of Mohammedans, wanted to bury it. The Mohammedans said that Kabir was a Muslim and therefore his body ought to be buried under Mohammedan rites. While they were quarrelling, Kabir's apparition appeared and said, "I was neither a Hindu nor a Muslim. I was both, I was nothing, I was all. I discern God in both. There is no Hindu and no Mussulman. To him who is free from delusion, Hindu and Mussulman are the same. Remove the shroud and behold the miracle." The shroud was removed, a large quantity of flowers was seen under it. Half of the flowers were taken by the king of Kashi and burnt on the bank of the holy Ganga. The ashes were then buried and a temple was built. This temple is known by the name of Kabir Chora, a great place of pilgrimage for the followers of Kabir. The other half of the flowers was taken by the Mohammedans and buried at Moghar, where Kabir died. A mosque was built over the grave. This is a place of pilgrimage for the Mohammedans. I'm going to put up a photograph of Lake Magadi, which is 110 kilometers from Nairobi and one of my favorite places still to visit, as is the Masai Mara, where I saw these two male lions crossing the plains. And I wrote then, male lions with rumbling stomachs. Political reflections. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. I'll put up a photograph of him casting his ballot in Baghdad, and obviously he's a pivotal figure. Polling began at 7 a.m. local time and closes at 6 p.m. Al-Maliki is hoping to win a third term in office, and Iraq remains a mess. But interestingly, when you look at sort of US policy, which was to stem the advance of the Shiite crescent for a long period of time, it was President Bush who toppled Saddam Hussein and put the Shias into power in Iraq. Mr. Barack Obama declared in Manila there was an Obama doctrine. It was cautious and incremental, saw military intervention as the last, not the first resort. This approach to world affairs might not be sexy, he continued, using baseball metaphors to explain. The goal was to avoid errors. Foreign policy progress consisted of singles and doubles. Every once in a while, we may be able to hit a home run. China Daily. In response to President Obama's visit to Asia, it is increasingly obvious that Washington is taking Beijing as an opponent. With Obama reassuring the US allies of protection in any conflict with China, it is now clear that Washington is no longer bothering to conceal its attempt to contain China's influence in the region. The editorial warned against believing Obama's sweet promises of a new constructive relationship between the United States and China, and it instead outlined what it described as a grim geopolitical reality. Ganging up with its troublemaking allies, the US is presenting itself as a security threat to China, it said. And then some interesting comments that Xi Jinping made on a trip to the western Xinjiang region. He said, "Police are the fists and daggers in the fight against terrorism. The Kashgar region is the front line in anti-terrorism and maintaining social stability," the official Xinhua news agency cited Xi as telling paramilitary police in the city of Kashgar. "The situation is grim and complicated. The local level police stations are fists and daggers," he said. "You must have the most effective means to deal with violent terrorists," Xi said at a police station. "Sweat more in peacetime to bleed less in wartime," he said. And, I touched on the importance of Xinjiang at the time of the Crimea annexation, and I said, a Crimea referendum business is a geopolitical conundrum for China. The problem being, if you allow that periphery states can vote, then you will definitely see a whole lot of China peel off real quick, from Tibet to Taiwan to Xinjiang. And, as I've said previously, I see the pivot to Asia as the encirclement of China and the shrinking of its operating theatre, distant blockade operations, as well as lighting the tinderbox that is the periphery. Russia was seeking to change the security landscape of Eastern Europe, John Kerry said on Tuesday, calling on Moscow to leave Ukraine in peace. Says NATO territory is inviolable. We will defend every single piece of it. I'll put up a photograph of Air Force One en route to the Philippines, from the Philippines to Washington. And the UN chief has urged South Sudan's care to help end violence and the anti-UN campaign. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon urged South Sudan President Salva Kiir on Tuesday to publicly call for an end to a negative campaign against UN peacekeepers and to bring to justice those responsible for attacks there on civilians and on the United Nations. He made a phone call to Kiir, called for an immediate halt to the vicious fighting and the appalling killing of South Sudanese civilians. More than 1 million people have fled their homes. Ban stressed the need to ensure that the perpetrators of the completely unacceptable attack on the United Nations mission in South Sudan, compound in Bor, and the ethnically motivated killings in Bentiu are swiftly brought to justice. Urged the President to intervene personally to stop the negative campaign against UNMISS staff and issue a public statement to this end. So it still remains fluid. It's not clear who's, I don't think either side can win. I've said that from the beginning. The Elysee Palace tweeted a photograph of President Hollande with José Eduardo dos Santos, the president of Angola. French officials welcomed Angola's president on Tuesday for the first time in 20 years, hailing his economic reforms and the clearest sign yet that Paris is turning its diplomatic focus to winning overseas contracts. Laurent Fabius rolled out the red carpet. France has a deep historical relationship with Africa. We want that to grow. We want to see the number of French companies increasing in Angola. I call on businessmen to invest in Angola, Dos Santos told business leaders at the foreign ministry. Despite its difficult ties, France has ploughed some 10 billion into Angola, making it the third biggest investor, although it is the sixth biggest trade partner behind the likes of the US, China, and Portugal. France has about 70 companies operating in the oil-producing nation, ranging from Air France to BNP Paris and Bolloré. The main investor is Total. Now the biggest operator in the country's oil sector, which is the largest in Africa after Nigeria. The Malaysian MH370, a report came out from a private company, says that it found that what it believes is wreckage of a plane in the Bay of Bengal that should be investigated as potential debris from missing flight MH370. possibility was dismissed by search coordinators. And I go back to Thomas Pynchon: if they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. And the point being, that's what I think the situation is. They're looking in the wrong place. And Gravity's Rainbow, of course, starts with that sentence: screaming came across the sky. And a lot of people felt that Pynchon was being premonitory about September 11. Euro 138.06, slipped back. Dollar index 79.79. Japanese yen 102.42. Swissy 0.8836. The pound 168.26, touched 168.53 yesterday, which was the highest level since November 2009. Aussie 0.9284. The Indian rupee 60.34. South Korean won at a 6-year high 1032.25. Rial 223.60. Egyptian pound just around the 7 level, and the South African rand 1056.59. Sterling is up 5.8% in the past 6 months and is the best performer among 10 developed nation currencies tracked by Bloomberg over that period. The Federal Reserve concludes a 2-day meeting today where practically everybody expects them to cut monthly purchases by $10 billion to $45 billion. Dollar index 79.79 does not trade with any vigor in my view, and it's difficult to get long it at this point in time. Although the US data is improving, the dollar's not responding. Euro versus the dollar 138.06. Clearly the market is nervous ahead of the latest inflation data. Sterling, well, I'll put up a 1-year chart. My objective is now 173.50. Britain's GDP rose 0.8% in the first quarter, up from 0.7% in the final 3 months of 2013, so continuing to build momentum. And I wrote about this in August when I said the recovery in the West is not a mirage, it is real. And I said, how does an investor play this recovery? I think you need to be net long sterling. Gold, back below 1300 at 1294.18. Prices retreated for a second day yesterday, but gold is up 0.9% this month after sliding 3.2% in March. Crude oil 100.45. Fell as low as 100.35 in electronic trading. Prices are down 1.1% in April, the most in 5 months, and I think it's overcooked. The geopolitical concerns about Ukraine come to the fore, but I think it really belongs around 90. South Korean won, I'll put up a 1-year chart. That's now at 6-year highs against the dollar. GDP increased 3.9% in the first quarter from a year earlier, the fastest in 3 years. Exports rose 5.5% in April from a year earlier, and the won gained 3.2% in April. India rupee just around the 60.31 level. I think it heads to 57.50 on a decisive Narendra Modi win, which I've been expecting for a while. I'll put up a photograph of a selfie he took after he voted. I participated in that Al Jazeera inside story about illicit cash flow in Africa. Continent-wide problems results in over $1 trillion siphoned off since 1980. If you have a chance to have a look at that. And I wrote that piece over the weekend, drawing on the IMF Sub-Saharan African Outlook report, where I said the rising fiscal imbalance is the region's Achilles heel. Bharti Airtel's Africa business has been a drag on the company, yet to turn a profit 4 years after spending $9 billion to acquire money-losing mobile phone assets in Africa. Bharti said performance in Africa was hurt by a seasonal downturn in parts of the continent and regulatory intervention in Nigeria, its biggest African market. Africa didn't do well, said Daljit Kohli. That's a disappointment because many people were looking for Africa to stabilize, that this time they would come to a break-even point, but this has not happened, so Africa will continue to be a drag on the good work that Airtel does in India. Revenue in Africa increased 16.4% in the 3 months ended March 31st, slowing from a 7.2% pace in the preceding quarter. The quarter was impacted by the seasonal downturn in parts of Africa and regulatory interventions in Nigeria. Our teams remain focused on accelerating growth through improving the quality of network, growing the data business, and the data business has been the real standout story for me amongst all these telcos, especially in Africa. Electrification in Africa, a question of credit. Some interesting data here. In March, an official from the USAID testified to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Over a year, a refrigerator uses 6 times more electricity than a Tanzanian citizen. And it would take an Ethiopian citizen 2 years to consume the amount of electricity that an American does in 3 days. Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, generates 28 gigawatts of power for more than 900 million people, about the same as Argentina generates for 42 million people. Saying without electricity, the rural population have no lights, children must do their homework under dangerous paraffin lamps, using a computer for schoolwork or anything else is impossible. And basically saying that foreign investors still remain wary. Africa needs to attract a huge amount of capital into this space, and obviously we've got President Obama's Power Africa project in the background as well. The South African all-share just shy of an all-time high, up 7.29% this year. Buyson, this is on the blog on the FT, feels that if the ANC polls about 55%, there will be panic within the organization. Interestingly, Standard Bank, about 20% of headline earnings now derive from the rest of Africa, up from 12% in 2010. They've taken a much more forward position on the continent. Dollar versus Rand, as I've said previously, I think it goes to 10 before it goes to 11. I'll put up a 3-month chart. The Egyptian pound flirting with 7. Egyptian stock market down 0.19% yesterday. It's up 21.58% and is Africa's best in 2014. Mohammed Badi says this ruling is the last nail in the coffin of the ruling powers that led to the coup. The regime is on the brink of collapse. I don't think so. Nigerian all-share down 4.25% this year. The Ghana Stock Exchange Composite Index up 5.46% in 2014, but has fallen about 8% from an all-time high in February. The Chinese People Liberation Army yesterday donated $4.2 million to the Zimbabwe Defense Forces. Meanwhile, General Key has praised President Mugabe for his stance against Western powers bent on destabilizing Africa. He was speaking at a dinner hosted for him by the Zimbabwe Defense Forces Commander General Constantine Chiwenga in Harare. General officers and men of China admire ZDF, especially your Commander-in-Chief President Mugabe, who has managed to stand against Western powers' machinations to destabilize the African continent. Your president is one of the few leaders of the likes of Fidel Castro, Vladimir Putin, and others who have stood against Western powers, few leaders of the courage to stand against the United States of America and its allies. Coming to Kenya, GDP in East Africa's largest economy rose to 4.7% from 4.6% a year earlier. GDP growth is the condition precedent of the Africa Rising narrative. The figure is lower than the government's initial estimate a year ago, as much as a 6% expansion in 2013. Tourism has been very weak, suffered a wave of gun and grenade attacks, including a shooting spree by Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Shabaab militants on the Westgate Mall in September that left 67 people killed. Tourist arrivals fell 18% to 1.4 million last year. That's a big drop. Hotel and restaurant industry was the only facet of the economy that contracted last year, declining 4.5%. Growth in the agricultural sector, whilst positive, decelerated to 2.9% from 4.2% the previous year. Manufacturing grew by 4.8%. Throughput at the Port of Mombasa increased by 1.8% to 22.3 million tons, so not much. Number of mobile connections rose to 30.4 million. Internet subscriptions rose significantly from 8.5 million to 13.3 million. They're going to add 5,000 megawatts to the grid, but on balance, this was much softer than I think I, for one, expected. I'd expected a peace dividend post the peaceful election, which sort of got shot down by the Al-Shabaab. Kenya has now delayed the release of its official economic growth forecast for this year as they digest the latest data. And then Robert Shaw saying it's quite a nice change from before, where all sorts of factors kicked in and it was all very turbulent, talking about macroeconomic stability. Um, Africa Oil is saying commercial threshold resources have been exceeded in the South Lokichar Basin. We know we've exceeded the commercial threshold and that it is going to get higher and higher. They're saying 600 million barrels, but a billion. Scan Group reported full year earnings per share expanded 22.17%. Billings up 13.596%. Direct costs up 20.681%. Revenue marginally down year on year. Some interesting, I haven't had a chance to look at it properly, but a revaluation of equity interest creating a 605.474 million shilling revaluation gain. Without that, the EPS would have been considerably lower. Profit before tax down marginally, profit after tax up, earnings per share up 22.17%, dividend 40 cents a share. Level of client spend in the first half was subdued due to the general elections, they said. The continued investment in growth disciplines, in particular digital and PR, and further developing our presence and potential in Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa and Tanzania led to a 16% increase in operating costs. Overall EPS is plus 26%, but the underlying EPS, excluding the revaluation gain, shows a drop of 70% to 0.63. It's one of the very few sub-Saharan African advertising pure plays and has crossed the nadir in its earnings, in my view. Barath was a great guest at Mindspeak, and he said, follow your passion. That's very true. Express Kenya has released full year earnings and a profits warning. Basically, they earned 1 cent per share compared to 37 cents the previous full year. I do not have a deep insight into the company. The Kenya shilling was lost at 86.85. The Nairobi All Share closed at a fresh record yesterday. It's up 10.633% this year. The NSE 20 is up 0.5997% so far in 2014. There's a link so you can check every and any listed share at the Securities Exchange. It's been a very strong April, hasn't it, with the banks, in particular the rebound in the EABL and the insurance sector leading the charge higher. Once again, thank you for stopping by. Wishing you a great day off tomorrow.